The factory worker's wrench froze mid-turn. Across the sprawling assembly floor in Buffalo, New York, a pilot's voice echoed, sharp and final. "I'm not flying that death trap." It was March of 1942. Another test pilot had just walked away from the Bell P-39 Airacobra. He was the fifth one to refuse that week. The aircraft sat gleaming under the hangar lights, its fresh paint still tacky to the touch. Everything about it screamed the future. Its distinctive mid-engine fuselage, its revolutionary tricycle landing gear, and most of all, the monstrous 37mm cannon mounted right in the nose. It looked like a world beater. But the men who were supposed to fly it into combat, the men whose lives depended on its performance, had another name for this revolutionary design. They called it the Flying Coffin. What made this rejection so devastating wasn't just the pilot's fear, it was the timing. America was reeling, desperately needing fighters to turn the tide against Germany and Japan. The factories in Buffalo were running 3 shifts a day, 7 days a week, a symphony of riveting and welding, trying to build an air force from a standing start. And yet, here was a brand new fighter rolling off the line by the dozen that nobody wanted to fly. The British had tested it and promptly canceled their orders. The French never even got a chance to fly theirs before their country fell to the Blitzkrieg. American pilots took one look at the performance specs and practically begged for transfers to anything else. Even Bell's own test pilots, the ones paid to be fearless, were starting to have serious second thoughts. So what was wrong? Looking at the P-39 on the tarmac, the problem wasn't obvious. It was sleek, modern, and it packed more raw firepower than almost any other fighter in production. That 37mm cannon wasn't just for show. It could punch through the armor plate of a German tank like it was tissue paper. A single hit could obliterate an enemy fighter. The design was, in theory, absolutely brilliant. By placing the heavy Allison engine behind the pilot, Bell's engineers had achieved near-perfect weight distribution. This cleared up the nose, making space for that devastating cannon. To get the power to the front, a long drive shaft ran right under the cockpit floor, connecting the engine to the propeller through a complex series of gears and bearings.
But this is where theory and reality began a catastrophic divergence. That long drive shaft, spinning at thousands of RPM, created a violent vibration that rattled through the entire airframe. Pilots described the experience as trying to fly while sitting on top of a washing machine during its most aggressive spin cycle. Precision aiming, a life-or-death skill in a dogfight, became nearly impossible. Worse, much worse, was the engine placement. In a conventional fighter, if your engine caught fire or exploded, it happened in front of you. You could see it, react to it, and maybe bail out. In the P-39, the engine was right at your back. Any mechanical failure meant that superheated oil, flames, and metal fragments were sent directly towards the cockpit. There was often no warning at all until you felt the fire licking at your flight suit. Before we continue this incredible story of failure and redemption, I'd love to know where you're watching from. The story of the P-39 is deeply connected to the air war on the Eastern Front, a topic often overlooked in the West. Let me know in the comments if you'd ever heard about the Airacobra's surprising Soviet service. And if you're enjoying these deep dives into the forgotten corners of World War II aviation history, do me a huge favor and hit that subscribe button. These stories take a massive amount of research to get right, and knowing you're out there, part of this community, makes it all worthwhile. Okay, back to the Flying Coffin. As terrifying as the vibrations and engine placement were, the aircraft's most damning flaw only became apparent the moment a pilot tried to climb. The Allison V-1710 engine, a beast at sea level, was utterly asthmatic at altitude. Above 12,000 feet, it choked and wheezed, starved for air. The power just bled away. This wasn't just a minor inconvenience, it was a death sentence in the European theater. German Messerschmitt Bf 109s cruised comfortably at 25,000 feet, sometimes higher. Japanese Zeros operated in the thin air even above that. An American P-39 pilot trying to intercept a formation of German bombers would find himself struggling for every foot of altitude, wallowing in the sky, while enemy fighters could dive on him from above with all the advantages of speed, height, and surprise. In early 1942, Colonel Bruce Holloway was tasked with evaluating the P-39 for combat deployment.
His assessment was scathing, a document that circulated through Army Air Force's headquarters like a death warrant for the program. He wrote, "The aircraft is fundamentally unsuited for the high-altitude interception role for which it was designed. Its ceiling is inadequate, its rate of climb is poor above 10,000 feet, and its handling characteristics at altitude are dangerous. I cannot in good conscience recommend this aircraft for combat operations against the Luftwaffe." That report should have killed the P-39. In any rational peacetime procurement system, an aircraft that so spectacularly failed to perform its primary mission would be canceled immediately. The factory would be retooled to build something that actually worked, like the P-47 Thunderbolt or the P-51 Mustang. But this wasn't peacetime. Rationality had very little place in the desperate calculus of wartime production. The United States was still reeling from Pearl Harbor. The industrial might of America was just beginning to stir. Factories were being built, workers were being trained, and complex production lines were being established. Canceling the P-39 program would mean shutting down the entire Bell aircraft manufacturing operation in Buffalo. It would mean laying off thousands of workers and starting over from scratch. The time lost wouldn't be measured in weeks, but in months, perhaps even a full year. So the factories kept running. The workers in Buffalo, probably hearing the whispers and rumors about the plane they were building, continued riveting together airframes, installing engines, and mounting weapon systems on aircraft that their own nation's pilots refused to fly. By the spring of 1942, a strange and embarrassing situation had developed. Hundreds of brand new P-39s were rolling off the production lines with absolutely nowhere to go. They were flown to storage fields across the country, where they sat in long, silent rows, unwanted fighters gathering dust while the war raged on without them. Then, from the other side of the world, came an unexpected and desperate solution. The Soviet Union, locked in a brutal existential struggle against the German invasion, needed aircraft. Any aircraft. Joseph Stalin had made it brutally clear through diplomatic channels. He needed fighters, bombers, and tanks in massive quantities, and he needed them yesterday.
The United States, eager to support its new ally and keep the Eastern Front from collapsing, began shipping enormous amounts of military equipment through the Lend-Lease program. Among those shipments were hundreds of Bell P-39 Airacobras, the very same fighters that nobody else wanted. Privately, many American officials saw this as a convenient way to dispose of an embarrassing mistake while technically fulfilling their obligations to the Soviets. The unspoken logic was cynical but simple. Send them the fighters we can't use, keep the good stuff like the P-47s and P-51s for ourselves, and hope the Russians can find some use for them. If the P-39s proved to be flying coffins on the Eastern Front, well, at least the pilots lost wouldn't be American. The journey these unwanted aircraft took was one of the most roundabout routes imaginable. They were loaded onto cargo ships in American ports, sailed through U-boat-infested waters all the way to the Persian Gulf, then disassembled, loaded onto trucks, and transported overland through the mountains of Iran into southern Russia. The journey took months. Many aircraft were damaged in transit. Some were lost to German submarines. But by late 1942, the first P-39s began arriving at battered Soviet air bases. And there, they received a reception that could not have been more different from the one they got in America. Soviet pilots approached the Airacobra without any preconceptions or prejudices. They weren't burdened by reports from American test pilots. They looked at the machine for what it was and for what they needed it to be. Crucially, they didn't care about high-altitude performance because they weren't fighting a high-altitude war. The air war over the Eastern Front was a brutal, chaotic, and muddy affair, conducted almost entirely below 10,000 feet. German Stuka dive bombers attacked Soviet trenches at low level. Soviet Stormovik ground attack planes strafed German tank columns at treetop height.
The desperate, swirling dogfights that defined Eastern Front combat happened down in the thick, soupy air of low altitude. And in that environment, the P-39's Allison engine performed beautifully. The first Soviet units to receive the Airacobra treated it like a strange foreign experiment. These pilots were accustomed to flying aircraft like the Lag-3, a fighter made mostly of wood that was notoriously underpowered and poorly armed. To them, the P-39 was a revelation. That 37mm cannon?
It could destroy einen deutschen Junkers Ju-88-Bomber mit einem singlen, wohlplatzierten Schuss. Der Aircrafts Stördier All-Metal-Konstruktion meinte, es könnte ein inkraubles Ampristos an Battle Damage erleben. Das wurde herausragendes Bild gemacht. Und down low, wo die Sowjetpiloten operierten, der P-39 war eigentlich faster und more manövrierbar, denn mehr von den deutschen Fightern es faced. Seniorleutnant Grigori Rechkalow war einer der ersten Sowjetpiloten, die die Airacobra in Kampf flog. Sein initiales Assessment, filed in Oktober 1942, revealed die starke Differenz in Pilot-Philosophie. Die amerikanische Maschine ist heavy, aber solide. Es doist climb well, aber es dived wie ein Stein. Der Kanon ist magnifique. Heute habe ich ein Junkers Ju-88 mit 3 Schälen erschossen. Der Aircrafts entire Tailsektion separierte vom Fuselage. Dieses Aircraft rewards aggression und punished hesitation. Das Singlesatz Rewards Aggression und Punished Hesitation bekam das währende Foundation von Sowjet Airacobra Tactics. Sowjetpiloten lernten zu fighten mit dem Plan, nicht gegen es. Sie nutzten es Stärken zu ihrem absoluten Maximum, während Situationen vermieden, die es Schwächen zeigten. Sie würden attackieren schwift von advantageösen Positionen und leashen ein devastierendes Burst von dem Kanon und dann nutzen den P-39s exzellente Dive Speed, um wegzubrechen, bevor Enemy Fighters konnten reagieren. In den Händen von Piloten, die unterstanden ihre unique Charakter, die P-39 transformierte von einem Flying Coffin in eine Lethal Predator. Und der Pilot, der trüglich die Airacobra meisterte, der eins mit der Maschine wurde, war ein Mann, dessen Name wird eine Legende in Soviet Aviation History. Alexander Iwanowitsch Pokryshkin. Boren in Sibirien in 1913, Pokryshkin hatte den Wehrkampf mit obsoleten Polikarpov I-16-Fightern gestartet, Tiny Ishak oder Donkey Plans, die hoffnungslos outclassed waren von den German Bf U-19s. Er überlebte durch schiere Skill und Grit, allwährend seine Kameraden fielen. Wenn er transitionierte zu dem P-39 in Ehrlich 1943, sah er nicht seine Fehler. Er immediately recognized its incredible potential. Pokryshkin war mehr als nur ein Pilot, er war ein Taktizier, ein Student der Aerial Combat. Er entwickelte einen kompletten taktischen System, spezifisch designt um die Airacobras Kapazitäten. Er kannte es die Formel für Airkampf-Combat. Ein methodischer Ansatz der Altitude Advantage, Speed Management und präzise deadly Gunnery.
His pilots would patrol at medium altitude, around 15,000 feet, acting as hawks, watching for German formations below. When they spotted their prey, they would execute a devastating diving attack, building up tremendous speed. They would close to point-blank range, fire a very brief, controlled burst from the 37mm cannon, and then use their momentum to climb away, disappearing back into the sky before the shocked German escort fighters could even react. The tactic was brutally, devastatingly effective. Pokryshkin's personal score began to climb at an astonishing rate. 5 kills, then 10, then 20. By the time the titanic Battle of Kursk erupted in July 1943, he was the Soviet Union's leading ace, and his unit, flying American-built Airacobras, was one of the most feared fighter regiments in the entire Red Air Force. German pilots began to recognize his distinct radio call sign. A chilling warning started to spread across German radio frequencies. Achtung, Achtung, Pokryshkin in der Luft. Attention, Pokryshkin is in the air. The Battle of Kursk demonstrated the P-39's capabilities on a massive scale. This was Germany's final major offensive on the Eastern Front, a desperate gamble involving thousands of tanks and aircraft. The Luftwaffe deployed its best units, fully expecting to achieve air superiority and protect their ground forces. Instead, they ran into a wall of Soviet fighter regiments, many equipped with P-39s flown by pilots who had spent months perfecting Pokryshkin's tactics. During the first week of the battle alone, Pokryshkin's regiment claimed over 100 German aircraft destroyed. His personal tally for the month of July 1943 reached an incredible 23 confirmed kills. The German offensive, which had relied on air power, found its Stuka dive bombers and Henschel tank busters constantly harassed and shot down by Soviet fighters that seemed to appear from nowhere, strike with overwhelming force, and vanish. By mid-1943, reports of the P-39's stunning success on the Eastern Front began filtering back to American intelligence agencies. At first, the assessments were met with utter disbelief. How could this be? The exact same aircraft that American pilots had rejected as a dangerous, unsuitable failure was now being reported as one of the most effective fighters in Soviet service?
Some analysts dismissed the reports as Soviet propaganda, wishful thinking designed to make their American allies feel better about sending them obsolete equipment. But the evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Soviet requests coming through Lend-Lease channels became very specific. They didn't ask for P-51 Mustangs. They didn't ask for P-47 Thunderbolts. They specifically asked for more P-39s, more of the supposedly inadequate Airacobras. By 1944, the Soviet Union was receiving thousands of them, and a whole generation of Soviet aces were using them to compile scores that rivaled the very best American and British pilots. Pokryshkin would end the war with 59 confirmed kills, almost all of them achieved while flying American-built fighters, primarily the P-39. The reason for this dramatic reversal of fortune came down to two things: operational environment and tactical philosophy. American fighter doctrine in 1942 was built around high-altitude bomber escort and interception. The P-39 had been designed for that role, and it failed miserably. Soviet doctrine was built around low-altitude ground attack and achieving tactical air superiority over the battlefield. For that mission, the P-39 was nearly perfect. The very characteristics that made it a failure in one type of warfare made it an ideal weapon in another. Back in the United States, the engineers at Bell Aircraft were absorbing the lessons from the P-39's bizarre, contradictory reputation. The aircraft's failures had exposed critical design flaws, but its successes in Soviet hands had validated some of its most innovative concepts. That tricycle landing gear, initially controversial, proved to be far superior to the conventional tail-dragger designs of the era. It gave pilots better visibility on the ground, dramatically reduced accidents during takeoff and landing, and made the aircraft much easier for inexperienced pilots to handle. Bell began work on an improved version, the P-63 King Cobra. It kept the P-39's basic layout, but featured a more powerful, supercharged engine and a host of modifications based directly on combat feedback from Soviet pilots. The P-63 would never see significant American combat service. But just like its predecessor, it was shipped to the Soviet Union by the thousands, where it proved highly effective in the final year of the war. More importantly, the lessons learned from the P-39's design began to influence the entire next generation of American fighters. Tricycle landing gear became standard on virtually every American aircraft that followed. The emphasis on pilot visibility, which Bell had pioneered with the P-39's unusual car door-style cockpit, became a top priority in all future fighter design. The concept of mounting a single, heavy, slow-firing weapon in the nose, validated by the P-39's success, influenced armament choices for years to come. And then came the jets. In 1943, when Lockheed's legendary Clarence Kelly Johnson began designing America's first operational jet fighter, the P-80 Shooting Star, the aircraft that emerged bore some striking similarities to the P-39's layout. Like the P-39, the P-80 had tricycle landing gear for safe ground handling. Like the P-39, it emphasized pilot visibility and ease of maintenance. And like the P-39, it placed the engine behind the pilot, though in the P-80's case, this was a necessity of jet engine design, not a choice made to accommodate a nose cannon.
The P-80 was everything the P-39 had tried to be: fast, modern, and revolutionary. It took the good ideas from the Airacobra while mercilessly eliminating the flaws. This connection between the despised P-39 and America's jet-age success was no coincidence. It was evolution, driven by hard lessons learned from both spectacular failures and unexpected triumphs. The P-39's failure at high altitude forced American engineers to finally master engine supercharging. Its success in Soviet hands taught them that there is no single definition of a good fighter. Mission, environment, and doctrine determine a design's true worth. Alexander Pokryshkin, the ace who mastered the Airacobra, ended the war with 59 confirmed victories, making him the second highest scoring Allied ace of the war. He was awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union 3 times, the highest honor his nation could bestow. In his memoirs, he wrote extensively about the Airacobra, calling it the finest fighter he had ever flown. "The American machine," he wrote, "taught me everything important about air combat. It rewarded skill and punished mistakes. It gave me the tools to survive and the weapons to destroy my enemies." In total, over 4,700 P-39s were delivered to the Soviet Union, nearly half of all the Airacobras ever produced. Soviet pilots flew them from the ruins of Stalingrad all the way to the heart of Berlin. These were the same flying machines that skilled American and British pilots had rejected as death traps. In Soviet hands, they became instruments of victory. The story of the P-39 Airacobra challenges our comfortable narratives about military technology. It proves that success and failure are often entirely dependent on context. The same piece of engineering can be both a total liability and a war-winning weapon, depending on how and where it's used. The fighter that nobody wanted ended up teaching American aviation designers some of the most important lessons of the war. Its flaws exposed critical gaps in their understanding. Its unexpected success demonstrated that design must always serve reality. Its innovative features, once refined, became the standard for a new generation of aircraft. When the North American F-86 Sabre, America's premier jet fighter of the Korean War, took to the skies in 1947, it carried the DNA of the despised P-39. The safe and predictable tricycle landing gear, the focus on pilot ergonomics, the understanding that a fighter is a complex balance of competing requirements. These weren't abstract principles, they were hard-won lessons, purchased with the embarrassment of rejection and paid for by the unexpected glory of Soviet victories. The story of the P-39 Airacobra is a powerful reminder that history's judgments are rarely simple. The aircraft dismissed as America's worst fighter contributed more to the future of American aviation than many celebrated icons. The flying Coffin that pilots refused to touch enabled Soviet aces to become legends. The failure that should have been canceled taught the lessons that would shape the future of air power for decades. Sometimes the machines we reject are the ones that teach us the most, and sometimes the worst becomes the foundation for the best.